Hey everybody, Derek Christensen here. I'm an owner of Legion Law, PLLC, a premier estate planning and probate law firm in Dallas, Texas. Today I wanted to talk to you about community versus separate property. What is it? What does it mean? And how does it affect you and your estate plan? But before I dive into that, I wanted to let you know how to reach out to me. You can find me in my email, Derek, D-E-R-E-K, at legionlawpllc.com, or you can go to my website, www.legionlawpllc.com. So with that, let's dive right into the topic of community versus separate property. Now, it really is just one of those two designations. Everything that you own falls under separate or community property if you're married. If you're single, everything's separate. It's very straightforward. But community property obviously applies whenever you are in a community property state. Many states have this, I think, well, actually maybe a dozen or so in the United States, but Texas is one of them. And that's where I'm living and practicing, so that's why we're talking about it. So in Texas, if you're married, anything that you acquire during that marriage is community property. That's the default. If you can prove it otherwise, then you might be able to get away with it. But if you have something that is acquired during the marriage, then it is community property, most likely. Now, community property, what does that mean? It means that it could be anything. It could literally, if I make all the money and my wife spends all the money and she doesn't make a penny, it doesn't matter. If the account is in my name and I buy a bunch of stocks and I used it with my wife's salary, heck, if I used it with my salary even, it doesn't matter. It was during the marriage, so therefore it's community property by default. So again, if it's my name and it's with my money that I earned and my wife didn't do a thing to get it, it's still her community property as well. So that's very important to remember because a lot of people think that's not the case. Separate property, on the other hand, is anything before the marriage or something received by an inheritance or a gift from a different person, or if you can specifically define it and pick it out as your specific property. What I mean by that last one, you can actually have agreements with your spouse to say, hey, we're going to make this, computer your separate property. So we'll sign an agreement that says, Derek, even though this is community property, technically speaking, we're going to make it separate property. So you can make those agreements with your partner to make sure that whatever you guys want is separate versus community. You can define it however you want, but by default, again, anything during the marriage, community, anything before or through an inheritance is separate property. Now, why does this matter? Separate versus community, well, who cares, right? Well, you should care a lot because in estate planning, you're only allowed to dispose of your assets to the extent that it's your separate property and half of the community property. That's extremely important. And if you die without a will, there are oftentimes different ways that we treat community versus separate property. So if I die without a will and I had children with a different person than my wife, then all of a sudden 2/3 of my separate property will go to my children, 1/3 will go to my wife, but if it's community property, it's half and half. So different assets start coming out of the woodworks, and all of a sudden it starts getting pretty complicated as to who gets what under what circumstance because I have two types of property. Again, with your will, you can just say, hey, I'm doing whatever I want with my full separate property and half of the community property. Almost always it's saying I'm going to give everything to my wife or my spouse or whatever. Which is totally fine, but you technically have the right to say, I'm going to give it to my uncle and not my wife. And so all of my separate property will go to my uncle and half of my community property can go to my uncle. But my wife is automatically entitled to half of the community property upon my death. So that's really, really important because if something is separate, the entire thing can go one way or another way, or whichever way I want it to go via my will or my trust. But if it's separate, or if it's community property, my wife automatically has half of it, no matter what. So it's very, very important that you make sure you keep your property separate if you want to keep that very strong line. Because if you ever commingle properties, if you ever have a bank account that received $20,000 from your mom and she passed away, right? And it's in the will, give Derek $20,000. So I got a bank account only in my name with my mom's $20,000. If I start taking my money and putting it in there that I earned from my job, if I start, buying cars with my wife, if I, take us out to restaurants and all that stuff, and I use that $20,000 to start living that way, and I start commingling everything, then eventually there is a very strong claim that $20,000 now becomes community property, and my wife gets $10,000 of that whenever I pass away, if it's still $20,000 by the time I pass away. So that's just really, really important. So Either way, like I said, there are ways that you can just simply define it a certain way that you want. You got to get your wife and you got to get attorneys and everybody's got to sign off on these agreements, but it's still possible. And if not, then it's default everything during the marriage, community property, everything before or received through an inheritance or a gift is separate. And separate, you can do whatever you want with it. Half of the community you can take care of, but the other half goes to your spouse. So that's kind of how estate planning and community property / separate property interact with one another. But if you have any questions on that and who gets what under what circumstance, and especially if you're a blended family where you have a lot of property from before your marriage and you want to make sure it's separate and you don't commingle it and all the bad stuff happens, then talk to me. I'll be more than happy to help, be a resource to be able to give you help in any way I can. So you can email me directly, Derek, D-E-R-E-K, at legionlawpllc.com. Or you can go to my website and go to the Contact Us page and schedule a free consultation over the phone directly on my calendar to chat. So have a great day and thanks for watching.